want to switch gears a little bit to shift from talking about how artists represent others, how they make up characters other than themselves, and look instead on how they make up themselves, how they make up their own representations as acts of self-interrogation and also as acts of self-promotion, as some kind of divided process between confronting oneself and knowing oneself better and branding oneself and calling the whole notion of self into question. You'll remember this image, I think, from our first week. This is Diego Velázquez's Las Meninas from 1656, and we're going to come back to it a couple times during the course of this class. Right now I want to focus particularly on it as a self-portrait. Velázquez has pictured himself in his studio. He looks out from behind his giant canvas, brushes in hand, and he situates himself in his milieu that is partly a milieu of art, and that is not only a function of the setting, but a function of the circuit of modes of representation, from the pictures in the background to the mirror in the background to the young infanta presented in the foreground. And he also pictures himself as a member of the court, as someone who is comfortable with the royal family and inhabits their same milieu. So we see Velázquez as an artist, and we also see him as a member of the Spanish royal court. And we also looked at this work by Frida Kahlo, Frida and Diego Rivera, and once again I want to think about it not only as a self-representation, but as a kind of canny positioning of self. I think Frida Kahlo really enjoys that she's so diminutive in relationship to Diego Rivera, and while he holds the brushes, she's actually making the painting. I also think it's important to her that she is dressed in more traditional Mexican dress, that she takes on the role of the carrier of Mexican tradition, even as she links herself to the history of modern art. So this small portrait is doing quite a lot of work in terms of the production of the artistic self through the convention of the artistic self-portrait. For the remainder of this lecture, I want to concentrate on two artists that were separated greatly in time. Cindy Sherman, an American photographic artist, came into her own as an artist just about the time that Pablo Picasso, a Spanish artist who worked primarily in France, passed away in the 1970s. But they are pretty good companions in a way in terms of exploring the possibilities of producing character as an artistic subject. So let's turn first to this early self-portrait by Picasso. It's a self-portrait of him as an artist. He's holding a palette, just as Velázquez did in Las Meninas. This portrait is done in 1906, and what's important to know is that Picasso was a great one at working out his own representation through his current artistic style. So in 1906, he's just at the moment of painting the Demoiselle d'Avignon, which we saw briefly when we interviewed Thomas Lawson. He was looking at a lot of African masks and other tribal objects in the Ethnography Museum in Paris at the time. And so you partly see that this is the artist as a young man, and you also see it as the artist as a young man seen through the lens of his current stylistic investigations. It's not only that Picasso is painting himself, it's that Picasso and his sense of his own work and his own identity are absolutely one and the same, so that he can't think of his own appearance except through the lens of his current artistic investigations. Let's juxtapose this with one of Cindy Sherman's untitled film stills from 1977. Sherman did a whole series of these works. They are single photographic images that are staged, and she is always the subject. And she titled them Untitled Film Stills, partly to give you the sense of a character in a narrative that would be cinematic in scope, but you've only got this one still to work from. So you feel as if there's a before and an after in this picture. You feel as if it's a photograph torn from a larger narrative, but in fact you don't have the larger narrative. You only have this one image that locates the female subject in a repertory of female housewives, domestic types in the late 20th century. It's a kind of canny nod in a way to Martha Rosler's Semiotics of the Kitchen. The woman in the kitchen, which is the proper domestic environment of middle-class women. And at the same time, she's looking out of the frame in a kind of knowing come hither way, juxtaposing the mundaneness of the kitchen interior with this pose from somewhere else, this pose of kind of romantic, erotic allure, kind of the pinup girl caught in a pretty unglamorous kitchen at the same time. Cindy Sherman, as an artist, is making up her identity as a series of masquerades and disguises in which she's both making this image and ironically commenting on the condition of women as being subjects of the image rather than makers of image, and producers of domestic products rather than artistic products at the same time. So one could kind of imaginatively swap that jar of Morton salt out for the palette and brushes in Picasso's hand, and the fact that it's not a palette and a brush is equally meaningful. Switch back to Picasso. Self-portrait as a young man contemplating the reclining nude. We don't have the artist's tools in evidence, but we do get that strong sense of who looks and who is seen, who produces images and who becomes an image. So that even though we have the conceit of a self-portrait as the artist looking at himself, he's looking at himself caught in a moment of contemplating the production of an image by looking at somebody else. And here's Cindy Sherman again, one of her untitled film stills. She takes on that reclining pose of the female subject, and she looks out of the frame in a kind of distracted way. But one of the interesting details of this image is that as much as she is displayed in this kind of cheesecake pose, she also allows the cable for the trigger device that she would have used to make this exposure show in the camera. She leaves her shutter release cable plainly in view, letting you know that she's not only the subject of this photograph, but she's the maker of it as well. And it was really important to Sherman that she made all these photographs herself, that she was performing for her own camera, and she was controlling the shutter click even as she was acting for the camera at the same time. Picasso also was an artist very interested in questions of masquerade and making up his identity, not only in imposing different sorts of aesthetic conventions on the self-portrait, but also making himself up as different kinds of characters. And in this self-portrait entitled At the Lapin Agile from 1905, which is set in a bar that Picasso and his friends like to hang out at, he pictures himself as a harlequin clown kind of figure, someone who is a kind of trickster performance artist, even as it's a self-portrait of the artist himself. Cindy Sherman will go on to do increasingly complicated stagings of herself performing the history of art and the history of female subjects in art. Here we've shifted from the black and white kind of quasi pseudo-improvised quality of the film stills to these very explicitly and luxuriously staged color photographs in which she enacts a figure from the Baroque tradition, at the same time that she lets you know in all sorts of ways that this is a very artificial restaging, so that even as she exposes her breast for the nursing child, it's very clear that that breast is a prosthetic device attached to her body, and that the amount of makeup that she's put on makes her look like a painted subject even as she's being photographed. There's an interesting way in Sherman's work that you come to realize that as many times as you've looked at these images of Cindy Sherman as someone else or as a character, you're never quite sure you would recognize her if you ran across her on the street. And that's one of the interesting aspects of her project, I think, that she gives you herself repeatedly, and at the same time that you never apprehend her true self, but only yet another made-up identity, made-up robbery from the history of art, made-up travesty of the history of film. Picasso, all through his life, will continue to address the self-portrait and will continue to embrace his aesthetic conventions and his aesthetic explorations as a part of his very identity by making his image over in those conventions. But as he moves throughout his career and as he approaches the end of his life, those images will take on a more contemplative air. And as much as they're extremely artificial and highly stylized, will become, in fact, I think, a bit more direct and a bit more honest about confronting the reality of one's own mortality, and the sense that on the one hand one lives forever through one's artwork, and on the other hand one confronts one's inevitable demise and inevitable inaging through the process of self-portraiture as well. And so the late works are very stark and very beautiful in this regard.